the resolution, we should move towards privatization, including the schools. Speaking for privatization is foreign line host William F. Buckley, Jr., Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, and economist Thomas Sowell, both senior research fellows at the Hoover Institute, Stanford University. Speaking against privatization are Albert Shanker, president of the American Federation of Teachers, Paul Starr, Pulitzer Prize winner and professor of sociology at Princeton University, and Bill Honig, superintendent of public schools for the state of California.
Mr. Buckley, one of the benefits is private choice, but one of the problems with choice, especially in a democracy, is that public schools and private schools have always tried to open doors for students, to give them something their families might not be able to give them on their own. And if you have a system that magnifies or accelerates the differences in this society right now, which increases those differences by allowing pure choice, by allowing marketing to individual interest, where are we going to be assured that somebody is responsible for transmitting some sense of common values, for the glue that holds us together, what this democracy is all about? How do we assure that we don't just fragment?
To tell you the truth, Mr. Honig, I see a lot of hypocrisy in the position about the public schools as publicly expressed by, for instance, representatives of the NEA. Let's take a recent example, shall we? They always say, well, religion is something that should be taken care of at home. Under the circumstances, it has no place in the classroom. Then a few weeks, months, years go by, and they say, now, of course, there's a thing called sex education. Sex education isn't being taken care of at home, so we got to take care of it here. 60 Minutes last Sunday was full of the responsibilities of public education to teach 13-year-olds how not to become pregnant on the grounds that it wasn't being taught at home. So really, what the philosophers of public education are saying to us is, we want to teach people what we're really interested in. We're not interested in religion. We couldn't care less whether they get religion back home. But we are interested in sex education, so we'll teach them that. I say, let us remember that the parents ought to remain dominant in these matters, and that it is they who ought to be able to select those schools that transmit those values concerning which they feel most ardently.
Well, let me respond as one educator with a very definite philosophy, and that philosophy is that the schools are responsible for transmitting our basic beliefs and values in this country, and that is one. Let me finish, please. And that is one of our objectives. And the question is, how effectively do we do that? We think that the role of religion in the creation of this country, the biblical tradition, all of that should be studied in school.
If you're telling me that we suffer in America from the notion that there is no academic responsibility to forward values, then I welcome your reiteration of the thesis of a book I wrote 35 years ago called The Superstitions of Academic Freedom, in which I pointed out that the notion that a teacher shouldn't say that the Declaration of Independence is a superior document to Marx's manifesto, because academic freedom takes a position that no positions are finally validated, is simply incorrect. But we live in a pluralist society, and people have a right to search out schools that seek to forward their values, and Mr. Sowell and I want to make this mechanically possible.
Fine, but we don't have to pay for it.
I would like to know whether you'd place any requirements on those private schools that could accept the vouchers of students. That is, would you permit a school that does not accept some children on the basis of religion? They're religious schools and they want to keep members of their own religion there.
Yeah, that's the old Bob Jones business. I think that if there is a sect that reads the Bible and comes to conclusions with which I disagree, I would yield to their right to interpret their religion in their own way.
That's not the question whether they interpret their religion. The question is whether, if they exclude children on the basis of the child's religious affiliation, whether you would permit a voucher to be spent in that school.
That's sort of a false question in a sense, because in many of the Catholic schools in the ghettos,
I'm not talking about those schools that do accept
well,
everybody.
Wait a minute. Let me make the statement, and then you can deny
everybody.
it. Then you can deny it or comment. The fact is that in many Catholic schools across this country, the majority of kids attending are Protestants, and that's especially true in the ghetto areas.
But those were not the schools that, well, all right, so you don't want to answer that question.
No, those are the majority of the private schools.
Let me emphasize that those of us who want to privatize, who want to have public institutions be controlled by their customers rather than by the politicians. We all want public institutions, and I insist the real issue is government versus private, not public versus private. Those of us who want the institutions that serve the public to be controlled by the customers are not in any way suggesting that the people who work for government institutions are lazy, inefficient, bad, or anything like that. It is not a criticism of the people. It's a criticism of the system. Someone came up to me in the intermission and said, I was a postal worker for 30 years. I worked hard. Of course he did. The individual postal workers, many of them, I won't say all of them, it's not true in private business either that all of them, but the great bulk of individual government employees are doing their very best to do their job. But the institutional arrangements under which they work make it impossible for them to do a good job. It's the system that's at fault, not the people. You had a dramatic example of this recently in Britain, where a government-owned trucking company, a transport company, was privatized, in this case by having the workers buy it, by a buyout, what we call a private buyout. That company had been losing heavily before. It is now making a very fine profit, and the shares in that company have something like quadrupled or quintupled. The same people, but the incentives were very different in operating. So I do not mean to criticize school teachers or postal service employees. On the contrary, what I want to do is to have a system under which they can do their job. I have had any number of school teachers who have complained that with the kind of administrative guidance they get from Mr. Honig and his fellow civil servants, it is very difficult for them to do their job. If you look at the record, the number of administrators in government schools has been going up much more rapidly than the number of teachers. The total amount of money being spent on schools has doubled, on government schools has doubled over the past 20 years per capita. The biggest increase in that has been for administration, not for teaching. But let's not divert the issue. The crucial issue is, shall parents, especially those in the lower and middle income classes, have the same opportunity to choose the schools to which their children go that we in the upper and middle income classes have? That's the crucial question. And to that answer, it seems to me you must say yes, and I believe personally that you must say yes to private and religious schools as well. Mr. Honig raises a question, shall the schools transmit values? No. The values of this country, of my country, of your country, has been formed by the people who occupied it, not by school administrators, not by educationists, not by the... We as parents should transmit values to our children. And we as parents, as citizens of our country, should in our political and ordinary activities, one with another, jointly form our values. That's what's made this country great. There wasn't any set of values dictated to the original occupants of this country. There wasn't any such simple set of values dictated to people of my generation or my parents' generation who were immigrants into this country or first-generation children. We got our values largely at home, at the school, and elsewhere. Schools transmit values. But we don't want a monopoly on the transmission of values. We don't want any small group of officials to have the power to say what values shall be transmitted. And yet that is what is happening now in a monopoly school system, and particularly as that school system has gotten more and more centralized. It used to be much better when you had local control of schools, because then you could have variety, diversity. But as the control of schools has moved from the local district to the city, from the city to the state, and from the state to the federal government, increasingly. The values that are being dictated are being determined by an increasingly unrepresentative selection of the population.
The slippery slope in the case of Mr. Friedman's proposal would lead toward public abandonment of financing of education. He's opposed to continuing that except in hardship cases. And I think if we get on that slippery slope, we need to see where we're sliding towards. There are a variety of other issues. I want to take up just finally the question of whether private schools have superior effects. Even if there is a private school advantage in the moment, it doesn't necessarily follow that an exodus of public school students into private schools would result in overall improvement. Just think about it. If the private school advantage comes from its greater selectivity, the greater ability of their selected students, or from the peer influence that they have been able to maintain, or because of the special commitment to education of the families who now send their kids to private schools, that advantage does not necessarily transfer to new students who would be sent to private schools under this system. Now, the fundamental assumption of Mr. Friedman, as he sketches it in his book, is that the benefits of education are fully captured by the individuals receiving it. In other words, that private benefit equals social benefit, and hence there's little justification for any governmental subsidy for schooling. But this misses a great deal. It presumes more perfect information, more perfect markets than currently exist, and it neglects the significance of the cultural and political benefits that education produces, that public schools produce, and that are not reflected in economic transactions. As a democratic society, we require an educated people capable of carrying the responsibilities of self-government. As a society knit together from very different threads, we need a system of education that helps to instill a sense of our common national identity and that weakens the force of racial and religious divisions. That is the reason we have had public schools, and it is an ideal worth fighting for.
One of the interesting things whenever you propose change is that people say you cannot guarantee that this or that will happen. You can never guarantee that anything will happen when you change anything. And if we really follow the logic of that, we would all be living in caves today. The argument that this is all a matter, there will be no guarantee of improvement as the mix of students going to the private schools changes, ignores the fact that the parents will be monitoring all of this. And we needn't argue about and speculate as to what might happen. They will have the choice when the time comes. I see a complete evasion on the other side here of the question of incentives. It's not a question of how we're going to drain the public schools of all its students. It's a question of what is going to happen when you have competition not only across public schools but between public and private schools. Now, if you think that the people who run the
what happens when, let's say you're right, and private schools are successful, you do get some to come over, the incentives have worked. What happens to the other 60 or 70% of the students who are left in the regular schools? What guarantees do you have that the education for them will
I thought we dealt with guarantees. Guarantees are incompatible
you have to
with
guarantee
freedom.
it because we have a system right now that educates 40 million children. If
Your
we're
system
wrong
guarantees
about this,
nothing except falling scores for years after years, which you and which the
have
establishment
sacrificed this nation. And it's not something to take lightly, and guarantees are important, or at least a good chance that this is...
Guarantee that cannot be redeemed is not important.
I think we do disagree on one basic point. I think a society that sets up an educational system that doesn't devote attention to transmitting its basic beliefs in democracy, in freedom, in character, is a society doomed for failure. It's committing cultural suicide. I think we can see the results of that system, and our question is how best to remedy it.
And you mean that the U.S. committed cultural suicide in the first 100 years of its existence?
I don't agree with your reading of the first 100 years. If you go back and read educational history, they did have a very clear vision of what they wanted to transmit to their students. They had the McGuffrey readers. It was a very
Of course, but it was the parents who transmitted.
It was the school that reinforced it. It was the school that enhanced it. And it was a school that brought up these higher ways of looking at democratic issues.
The issue before us is one of great importance. It's not just an issue of ideology. It's an issue of the kind of country and society we're going to have. When the first person retired on Social Security in this country, there were 17 people in the workforce supporting that person. Only a few years from now, we will come to a different situation, one in which for every person on Social Security, there will only be 3 people in the workforce, and one of those 3 will be black or Hispanic. If our society does not do a more effective job than it's doing now, we'll have 2 people working, one supporting someone on Social Security and one supporting another person who is dependent on public funds, with the result, of course, being disastrous for everyone. We have had in this country a system which has worked over 200 years, a system in which most people have been proud and which did go astray in the 1960s and which is being turned around at the present time. We're now being asked to embark on a great experiment, to pull apart this system, to have many millions of children leave the public schools and go into private schools.
As long as they are free to choose, if I may coin a phrase, there is no reason why, if the private school is the worst thing in the world, the parents, the kids will be any worse off, because they can always stay with the system we have.